I've been asked to do a very general introduction to what it says up there, costs, benefits, options, what you can do, and a little bit on planning. So this is quite a broad introduction. However, as Eva says, the reason I'm here is because I've been involved over the last 10 months or so with the Bath Preservation Trust in a project which some of you may have been involved in called Low Carbon Bath. And the aim of that project has been to try and identify how we can improve the energy performance of the traditional and historic buildings in Bath. I'm not going to just talk about traditional and historic buildings today. It's the partnership between the Trust and the Centre for Sustainable Energy, which is a charity based in Bristol. And that's where I worked until the end of last month. So I'm actually here on my own account because I no longer work for them. But I'm still involved with the project. The project looked, as I say, on listed and traditional buildings. For example, here we have a listed building, and here we have an unlisted but traditional building. So the project was about basically the buildings built before 1919, which have got solid walls, not cavity walls, but solid walls, so stone, or brick, or rubble stone walls. And they present particular problems in terms of how we improve their energy performance. In particular, their walls are a problem, because a cavity wall, if your house is a relatively modern house, a 20th century house, you would have a hole in the middle of the wall which you can fill with insulation. You can't do that in a traditional house. And that presents all sorts of problems, both in terms of protecting the character of the city and also in terms of ensuring that the building is protected if you make changes to it. I'm not going to talk a lot about that today, as I say. That's the background. And as Eva said, we did this survey in January and February, which some of you may have contributed to, which was about the acceptability of making changes to listed buildings in Bath. At the moment, there are very few changes, energy performance changes, you can make to listed buildings. So we did a survey to see what the public acceptability of a whole range of changes was, and we're publishing the results of that survey, together with some very detailed guidance about what you can actually do to these buildings, to traditional buildings. So in May, I think that's when we're going to launch it, there'll be, as I say, some guidance published, which will be both available on the web and as a published document, which takes you through all the different things you can do in traditional buildings in Bath, and gives you kind of detailed guidance about what you can do to improve the energy performance, and what the kind of local planning restrictions are, and also where you can get advice and help locally. Now, if it's all right with you, we've got your emails today at the front, so if it's okay with you, I've asked Eva to send those on to me, and I'll make sure that you're all informed when that guidance is published. So if that's okay, then you can all get access to the copy of the guidance. Alternatively, just keep in touch with the Bath Preservation Trust. Okay, what should I do? Answering this question is not really very straightforward when it comes to trying to improve how your home works, because there are so many different things you can do, and you hear so much about the different options available, and lots of people are keen to sell particular solutions to you. You may have people knocking on the door trying to do that. But you have to think about a whole range of things. Obviously, you want to think about the benefits, but you also need to think about the costs. There are also risks you have to think about, especially if you're in a traditional building. And then there are particular opportunities and constraints. And the constraints include things like planning restrictions, the nature of the building you live in, and all sorts of things which may limit what you can do. So I'm going to talk about that range of issues today. I hope I don't get too technical. I'll be trying to be fairly quick. So, benefits. I think we're going to hear a bit more about this later on, so I mean very quickly. Obviously, if you're trying to improve the energy efficiency of your home, you might hope that you'll get lower bills. But you might also hope you'll get a warmer home. That's a particularly important issue in Bath, which actually has one of the highest rates of excess winter mortality, i.e. the highest rates of number of people dying from cold in the winter in the country. And that's a reflection of how cold so many of the houses in Bath are. Obviously, if you care about climate change, if you reduce your energy consumption, you'll reduce your carbon emissions. And also, looking to the future, we know that energy prices have gone up a lot. Well, they may do a great deal more. We can see an extremely turbulent world around us. We know that in the long term, fossil fuels are going to decline. They may decline much more rapidly in the short term if political instability continues. So the lower your need for energy, the more resilient you are to those kind of changes. Finally, you might want to make money. I mean, this is quite a recent one, but actually, if you're aware of the kind of special tariffs available for people who install solar panels on their roofs, that's actually been quite an incentive for people to install those panels because they get such a good return on them. However, I'll come back to that about whether that's really a good idea or not. Costs, well, of course, there are lots of costs. There's the capital and labour costs, there's all the hassle and disruption. There's quite a lot of anxiety, maybe that's why you're here today. What should I do? Am I doing the right thing? Have I got the right people? Are they going to rip me off? Is it going to work? Am I doing this properly? Should I be doing that first? So there's lots of that to worry about. There may be impacts on your home, such as loss of room space, for example, if you do internal insulation. And, we're in Bath, and therefore we have to think about the impacts on the street and the city as well. Everyone in the city values the kind of quality of the built environment of the city, but people have slightly different opinions about how important that is compared to the pressure to improve the energy performance of the buildings within the city. Now, I think, and very much the view of the work we've been doing with the Trust is that you can bring those things together in such a way that you have actually relatively little disruption to things like the visual, the views of the city. But we have to think carefully about those issues. And of course, in listed buildings, in the city, we also have to think about historic fabric, and that becomes can become a really difficult issue for some listed buildings. So, all those things to think about. We also have to think about the risks. As soon as you start doing work in any old building, you might find that you end up with more work than you expected because old buildings are full of surprises. And if you do anything major to an old building, that's very likely to happen, unfortunately. You need to make sure that the work is done well, otherwise it won't necessarily work. There are worries about technology. Some people worry that if you do a lot of kind of air tightness improvements, like draft stripping and insulation to an old building, you might end up with very poor air quality because you don't get drafts anymore. And some people actually rather like drafts. To which I would say the modern way of building is to what's called build tight and ventilate right. So although sometimes it is necessary to, sometimes you do have a reduction in air quality through lots of draft proofing, you can deal with that by introducing controlled ventilation if you need to. Now I think actually in most traditional buildings in Bath in particular, less so the more modern ones, if you do a lot of draft stripping, it's unlikely you'll get to a point where suddenly you'll begin to feel that the house is very stuffy, because there are so many ways in which air can get into those buildings. Nonetheless, it's worth thinking about, and you may need to introduce some ventilation as well. So that's one of the risks. The other risk is that if you do a lot of work, insulation work, for example, at anywhere in a building, what that does is it creates, if you put insulation against a wall, or you put insulation in your loft or under your floor, what happens beyond that insulation is that everything gets much colder. And that can create risks of increasing downpour condensation, because if your loft or your underfloor or your walls are colder, that means that it's much more likely that any water vapour will condense in those spaces. Again, there are things you can do about that. But if you're doing any kind of major works which involve insulation, particularly in traditional homes, it's worth getting professional advice to make sure that these kinds of risks are addressed.